All right, we're doing this one a little bit differently, regardless actually of how you're taking in the content over the next couple of days. Quickly here, welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Today is Orlando Magic on the podcast, but we're actually going to be doing the double dip in just a slightly different way. Later on today, we will be releasing. So I guess for folks that are listening to the show audio only, it won't be all that different. We'll get the Washington Wizards later on today. For those that like to watch live on YouTube, that's really where things are different. So all the different teams are going to be broken up into individual shows, at least for the next few days, while I get ready to go out of town for a couple of days. So this is just going to be the Magic on this episode. No matter how you're taking it in, there will be a Wizards show later on today. We're probably going to do the same thing tomorrow with two more teams. And my hope is that if there's time, and I think there will be, I'll be able to record a couple of these video and audio that I can release Monday, Tuesday, even from the road. So that's the hope. That's what I'm attempting to try to pull off. I know, apologies, I didn't get straight into the fantasy stuff, but I thought that was important for everybody to know just as they kind of game plan for how content is going to be coming out on this podcast and YouTube feed. I am Dan Besbris. I am also at Old Man Squad. That's both Twitter handles. Either one is A-OK. At Old Man Squad is where you're going to get all of our shows. So everybody that's under the network umbrella, their shows will be tweeted out over there. At Dan Besbris is where you're going to get all of my fantasy and normal daily life thoughts throughout the year. Please do take a moment at the front end of this show. I'll remind you guys once again, like, rate, subscribe. It is game-changingly important for me over here as I continue to try to build up a following of the new podcast feed and also, of course, of the Old Man Squad. Talking Orlando Magic today, or first half, I guess, of our two shows today. A team that made one, I'd argue, medium-size reality move during free agency, but almost no fantasy moves during free agency. So our goal on this show is going to be less about trying to isolate where the value might be for the Magic, because we already know the answer to that. And the answer is basically Franz Wagner if you're in a category league, and Franz plus Paolo Banchero if you're in a points league. And more so, where can we locate sneaky little decisions that might, maybe, perhaps, help our fantasy teams? Let's start with the only player on the Magic that I would argue is kind of a sure bet, and that's Franz Wagner. He's number 69 in 9 category leagues last year. Make sure I don't have all my settings right for those that are watching and see the graphic up on the screen. Finished the season at 19.7 points per game, 1.3 3-pointers. Kind of low there, actually, all things considered. 5.3 rebounds, 3.7 assists. 1.1 steals, 0.4 blocks, 48% from the field, 85, nice number there at the free throw line, and just 1.9 turnovers. He was someone that I'll admit I was skeptical on where the next big leap might come from. And I don't know that we could call it a big leap because he basically went from like 90 to 70 as a medium. It's really a small leap, honestly. For players in that range, you can jump from 90 to 70 pretty quick. And the reason that I was skeptical on Franz Wagner was not so much a doubting of his basketball ability, but more so a doubting of what more was available for him to do season over season. Franz went from 18.6 points per game to 19.7. He added 1 point, actually lost 0.3 3-pointers. Rebounds went up from 4.1 to 5.3. Maybe some of that was because Wendell Carter Jr. missed so much of the season, although he missed a bunch of the previous year also, so I can't really isolate it other than to say that maybe Franz just became a better rebounder. Assists stayed the same. Steals and blocks for Franz went from 1.2 to 1.5 combined, and that was really it. Field goal free throw was almost exactly the same. Turnovers actually went down by 0.2. So we're talking about like really narrow margins overall on Wagner. And I think like the other thing was free throws went from 4 to 4.4. So that also got a little bit better. And that, I think, really illustrated what my main concern was with Wagner year over year, which was, where is all of this extra usage that everybody wanted him to get? Where was it going to come from? Because Paolo was also on his way up. He took only 15.6 shots per game last year. He jumped to 17.6 this season, and he's not about to relinquish that to these other dudes. So Franz, who frankly is the more efficient offensive player between those two guys, Paolo can get to the foul line a little bit more. He's a little bit more of a bulldozer out there, but Franz is, I think, inarguably the more skilled offensive player. Sure, he deserved more offensive role, but there was really never a way to point and say, oh, this is how he's going to get it. And in fact, the guy who actually suffered the most season over season, it wasn't those guys. It was the guards. It was Markelle Fultz, who went from 11 shots down to like 7.5, and Cole Anthony went from 10 down to 9.5. The guards gave up what they had to give it to Paolo, more to Paolo, and more to Franz Wagner. It's also worth pointing out that Wendell Carter Jr. went from 11 shots per game last year to only 8 this season while battling additional injuries, but his role shrunk considerably as well with the emergence of, I don't want to say like Mega Goga Batadze time or Mega Mo Wagner, but those guys just playing consistently throughout the year meant that Wendell Carter Jr. wasn't going to get 30 minutes a game without some sort of challenge to his role. So what could we possibly add? I ask kind of the same question again to Franz Wagner. I wish the answer was something. I really do, because he's the guy who has the fantasy profile on this team. There are other guys that have some fantasy game, like Jalen Suggs. We saw some fantasy game there. He got close to it with a lot of defensive stats. And obviously, Jonathan Isaac is a fantasy juggernaut, but, you know, poor Jonathan Isaac's body. And we'll talk about these guys in just a minute. But the guy on the floor that you're like, oh, this is the guy who very easily could have consistent fantasy value if only they were like, he should be the number one scorer. That's Franz Wagner. But I see nothing in the makeup of this Magic team that suggests he's about to just flip-flop who gets 17 shots and who gets 15 with Paolo. If it was about to flip-flop, I'd say, shit, take Franz Wagner at 50. But it ain't going to happen. So 70 is about where he should go. I think that's probably not that far off from where he goes. Probably in the 60s. I bet he gets drafted in the 60s. And you're probably going to take the world's tiniest haircut on it, but you'll be okay. He's one of the players we talk about a lot who's probably going to get drafted pretty close to where they belong. And that's okay. That's going to happen a lot of the time. It's a very boring fantasy take because it's more interesting to say, oh, this guy's going to be a huge bust, or this guy's going to conquer mountains. When in reality, most fantasy players are just sort of like, okay, yeah, that's fine for draft day. And Franz Wagner, fine, is my guess at least. And again, we may be 1 week away from having our first pre-ranks out there with Yahoo Leagues. But my guess is Franz is going to be just fine. Second highest ranked player in 9-cat this past year was Jalen Suggs. But let's talk about Paolo Banchero, because he is a very unique fantasy makeup. He played 35 minutes a game this last year. He played 80 ball games. That stuff is really good. The 22.5 points is good. The 7 boards, the 5.5 assists is very good. There is a lot of Kyle Kuzma built into the Paolo Banchero fantasy lines, like extraordinarily similar fantasy lines. Kuzma last year was at 22, 6.5, and 4 with 1.2 defensive stats. Paolo was at 22.5, 7, and 5 with 1.5 defensive stats. And then percentages, Paolo, 45.5 and 72.5. Kuzma, 46.5, 77.5. So Kuzma better in the percentages. Paolo a little better in defensive stats and a little better in rebounds and assists. But overall, they're very similar fantasy profiles, especially if Paolo gets better at his percentages. Paolo Banchero is a guy you're just sort of not drafting in 9 category leagues unless you're punting I would say two things that comfortably gets him to a spot where you'd want to deploy him. Because if you're just, say, drafting free throw, Banchero goes to 99, which is fine, but still probably not as high as he's going to get drafted. If you're just drafting field goal, he only jumps to 134, which is not much of a leap. If you're just drafting turnovers, he jumps to number 100. It has to be a combination of two of those. And the most common one is field goal and turnover, which gets him to rank 84. The one that actually sees the largest jump in terms of combo punting is free throw and turnover, and that jumps Paolo all the way up to number 60. So he is not, and I know that there's been a big shift towards this -1 way of ranking, which, probably lends itself more to a head-to-head style of fantasy basketball. Paolo is at -2. You got to punt two things to get him anywhere near where he's going to get drafted this year. And you know who's not punting two things and has two thumbs? I almost messed that one up. This guy right here. So I want nothing to do with Paolo. He's a points league darling. The term points league darling, of course, I use sort of flippantly to mean someone who's generally bad at both percentages and turnovers. And Paolo is the glowing, sparkling example of this, because unless you punt two of his bad categories, he stays outside the top 100. Sorry, outside the top 98, because one of those got him up to rank 99 last year. And I don't know, one thing that I feel like I do need to clarify, because people sometimes misread the way I'm talking about these players. He could get better at some of that stuff. You could see the turnovers come down. You could see the percentages inch their way up. But again, he's so far away in 9-cat that little baby jumps in any of them is not going to get it done for me. And it's certainly not going to get him anywhere near where he gets drafted. So you might be like, oh, Dan, what if he gets a little bit better on all three? Okay, maybe he claws his way towards the edge of the top 100, but he's going to get drafted in the 60s or 70s, I would think, at the very latest, because he scores and boards and assists a lot. And it's that same sort of Kyle Kuzma-ish type of thing, where if you can do all of that stuff, you're not going to fall that far, even if you should. If he gets a little bit better in all three, he might get to the point where you could punt one category and get him to like that 85, 80 range. But even that's still probably not going to get you to where he's drafted. And so my assessment is, we can't, I feel like I need to go back and explain myself again. You can't really handicap a player and say, I know for a fact he's going to get much better at all of these things. He's still very young, mind you. This is still only year 3. But all we can really assume from watching player career arcs is that there will be small, incremental, little positive blips for these troublesome spots. Like field goal, is he going to go from 45 to 50? Odds are probably not. Could he go from 45 to 46.5? Maybe. Is free throw going to go from 72.5 to like 84? Almost definitely no. Could it go from 72 to 76? Yeah. Could turnovers drop from 3.1 to 1.9? No. To 2.8? Maybe. And so if you do all of those things, he gets himself near the top 100. If he does one of those things, he moves up, 20, 30 spots. So there's these little things that you can say probably happen. But if you're drafting Paolo Banchero at like 65, you're basically saying, I think all of these things is going to happen. And that is a saucy, saucy play to make, when we've seen basically one example of that over the last 15 years. And it was Brandon Ingram going from LA to New Orleans, when he fixed 3-pointers, free throws, and defensive stats all in one swoop. And then defensive stats came back to earth. It was like a 1-year blip that didn't even turn out to be a lasting thing. Guys just don't fix 3 things at once. It doesn't happen. There are a number of other Magic players that need a little bit of our attention on today's podcast. I want to start with the newest Magic, and that's Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And he's the one player that YouTubers are not going to see on their screen, because I don't feel like flipping back to Denver and resetting the system. But KCP last year, I'll just read it off to you. He was number 105 in 9 category leagues, buoyed by a very low turnover number and having solid free throw and defensive stats with other stuff that was just good enough not to be truly horrible. He averaged 10 points per game, 1.63 pointers. Actually, rebounds was pretty horrible at 2.4. Same assists, 2.4, but again, not as terrible because you're trying to get to like 3.5 instead of 6. 1.3 steals, 0.6 blocks. That was nice for KCP. He did it on 46% low volume. That's fine. An 89% foul shooter. That's solid. And then, as we mentioned, super low turnovers. My hope is that KCP parachutes into Orlando and gets a little bit, not a lot of it, but a little bit more usage than he got in Denver. The big difference, at least from my vantage point, is that KCP in Denver was very much the 5th option in the starting 5. And the numbers bear that out. Jokic was number 1, Jamal Murray was number 2, Michael Porter Jr. was number 3, Aaron Gordon was number 4, KCP was number 5. And if you're really comparing to the team, Reggie Jackson actually averaged more shots per game than KCP last year. Mind you, that was a number that was bumped up by 23 games when Jamal Murray was out, but whatever. In Orlando, there aren't as many. I have to be careful how I frame this. In Denver, there were 3 guys that took 13 shots or more per game. Jokic was at 18, plus all of the assists. Jamal Murray was at 17, plus a bunch of assists. And Michael Porter Jr. was at 13.3. In Orlando, Paolo was at 17.5. Franz was at 15. So we're already like a shot and a half, 2 shots per game more available for the rest. And there was no 13er in there. Suggs was 9.5. Cole Anthony was 9.5 this last year. And then you drop all the way to Wendell Carter Jr. at 7.7. Fultz at 7.6. So there was just more available in Orlando for whoever the next guy was. And as you look at what might be the Magic starting 5, I'm guessing, and we still don't know the big man spot, it'll be Wendell Carter Jr. or Goga or Mo Wagner or possibly even Jonathan Isaac, who did start a game, I think, at center at the end of the regular season and in the playoffs last year for them. So you're going to get Franz, you're going to get Paolo. Those are the obvious ones. KCP is going to be in there now. I'm thinking you probably see Jalen Suggs in the starting 5. Maybe slides down to point guard and KCP becomes the 2 guard as opposed to Markelle Fultz being in there. Is Fultz a free agent right now? It doesn't even matter. I don't think he's starting. I think we've sort of seen the Fultz growth arc and it's kind of capped itself out. I believe they brought back Gary Harris, if I'm not mistaken, but he'll slide into a smaller bench role as well. So they have plenty of depth on this team. But in terms of top tier offensive options, they only really have 2, where the Nuggets had like 3.5. Because Suggs, I mean, he was fine on offense, but not as good as the 4th option in Denver. That's what I would argue. Compare all of these guys to Aaron Gordon, because none of these guys is getting close to MPJ in offensive ability. Compare them to Aaron Gordon. Is there anybody on the Magic besides Paolo and Franz that we can reasonably say is as good as or better than Aaron Gordon in terms of offensive option? Cole Anthony, I'm going to say no. Suggs, I'm going to say no. Frankly, Mo Wagner is probably your best name to throw out there because he's pretty good on offense, but he can't guard anyone. That's why the minutes stay somewhat low. And he's sort of like a high energy for 18 to 20 minutes a game type of dude. And then Jonathan Isaac, like he's a maybe, but also we know he's not going to last forever. That's the other option, by the way, the Magic. Do they go Jonathan Isaac at the 4 and slide everybody down? Do they play Jonathan Isaac at the 5 against some smaller teams and then just not play Wendell Carter Jr. or the other big? So those are things that are on the table and will be things that we discuss here in about 90 seconds on the show. But in terms of what it means for KCP, which is where we need to loop back around to, we're talking about Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I think he can probably wiggle his way to more than the 7.7 shots per game he got last year. The goofy thing about KCP is that even when someone was hurt on the Nuggets, his shot per game count didn't change all that much. When Jamal Murray was out, it was more like Michael Porter Jr. and Aaron Gordon did more, and they didn't quite get Reggie Jackson also, and those shots didn't quite get all the way down the pecking order to KCP. But he's had plenty of seasons in his career where Caldwell Pope has taken more than 7.7 shots per game. In fact, even the previous season, when Michael Porter Jr. missed a few extra games and Jokic missed a few extra games, and Bruce Brown was like the second unit point guard, even then, Pope had 8.3 shots per game. And that's really what you're looking at here. Will KCP play 31, 32 minutes a game? Will he get 8.5 shots per game in Orlando? Because if so, and I get it, it'll still be a very boring option, but that would probably put him inside the top 100. I think they're banking on some decent health for him. I don't know that we can guarantee it, but he's been relatively healthy throughout his career, playing through a lot of the smaller things. That's kind of what you're looking for in, can a guy get into the 70s in games played? And that plays in all formats. I know you head-to-headers are like, this guy's a low turnovers dude. What's he really going to do for me? Well, there is a value in having someone with a 4-game week play in all 4 games. And I know steals fluctuate wildly, but over the course of this past season, he got about 110 steals. You can't allocate those exactly how you'd want to. He also blocked 36, 37 shots this last year, I think. Nope, sorry, that was the year before. But they occurred. That's the passive voice. I get it, but they're going to fall somewhere. In Roto, it's very easy to visualize. You're like, okay, what's it going to do for my team if I throw an extra 35 blocks and 110 steals? The answer is a decent amount. Head-to-head, you're like, is this going to do anything week to week? Well, yeah, it will. Because if he's upright and he's sitting just inside the top 100 and suddenly he makes you maybe more competitive in turnovers, a category that perhaps you were thinking you might try to lose anyway, there's a value in that. Not an exciting one, but there's value. And I know the retort that many of you are thinking. You're like, Dan, haven't you been spending time this offseason talking about taking shots with your late picks for someone that might be, a top 65 type of value? Yes. And haven't you been mocking Harrison Barneses of the world? Yes. But there's a big gap between Harrison Barnes and KCP. They're both super boring, but one of them, the math rolls him out to like a top 140, 160 range, and the other is sitting at 95. Pretty much anyone inside the top 100 is valuable in a 12-teamer. I don't really care how they got there. Punting turnovers, obviously, he takes a pretty medium-sized step backwards, but if you even have the slightest inkling of competing in turnovers, if you want to even win them like a third of the time, then yeah, there's value there too. So I like KCP as someone to draft at like 130. I think you'll find he can be a safe play where you've taken a lot of shots and you're like, you know what, I need like a 10th guy that I can just put into my roster and not worry about it. He can be that guy. The other names we're going to talk about, by the way, on today's show, just in case you're interested in who we're actually going to cover on the Magic, I am not going to be covering Cole Anthony. I'm not going to be covering Mo Wagner. I will briefly cover Goga Bitadze right now, and then we'll talk Wendell Carter Jr., Jalen Suggs, and Jonathan Isaac, and we'll wrap things up. Goga Bitadze is worth a look if he gets the starting job. How's that for a brief discussion? Because when he was playing about 24 minutes a game, he was sitting right around the edge of the top 100, mostly on blocks and field goal percent, and a little bit of rebounding, and that would be what you're hoping for, which is basically the hope is, if you're a big Goga fan, that he leapfrogs Wagner and Wendell Carter Jr. permanently and just locks into 25 minutes in the starter's job. And I just don't see that happening, so I'm likely not drafting Goga in fantasy leagues. All right, Wendell Carter Jr. No. I'm wagging my finger at all of you that drafted him last year, even when I yelled at you repeatedly not to. He is a 9-category mess of a fantasy player. Sorry, it's just the truth. He doesn't do the things you'd normally want out of a center other than basically field goal percent. If you're looking at the positive categories for Wendell Carter Jr. this last year, he had 3 of them turnovers, field goal percent, and just barely rebounds. Although for a center, 7 isn't really a positive. Compared to the whole league, it is, but compared to centers, not really. Even when Wendell Carter Jr. was a full-time starting center, which is basically just the previous year before other guys on the Magic started to provide things that he did not, he was still only number 103. That was in full starters minutes. So that's like kind of a best case scenario. That's not fair. Best case scenario would be if he fixed his free throw shooting on top of getting an unfettered starters run. But I don't think that's happening this year for him either. And so in 9 category leagues, I will kindly pass. Word is he's on the trade block. Then you start to look at Goga, by the way, or even Mo Wagner. If Wendell Carter Jr. gets traded, we can do a little bit of a rehash here. I'm not talking about Markelle Fultz. I think his time in the Sun has basically ended. So the last 2 players I want to talk about are Jalen Suggs and Jonathan Isaac. We'll do Suggs first because we did finally see him take that big leap forward this last year that I think we were all kind of hoping for. He had a super hot start to the year, went through a pronounced midseason shooting slump, and then kind of got it back together towards the end of the year, which is, I guess, what you'd call your kind of typical arc for a young player that hadn't really made it through a full season of NBA starter, kind of. Played 27 minutes a game last year. Kind of starter minutes before. He'd been hurt. His prior seasons in the NBA didn't play big minutes in those years, so his endurance for a full year hadn't really been tested yet until this last one. But we saw a lot of stuff to like with Suggs. The reason I think that they go KCP Suggs backcourt is I think they're just going to run the offense through Paolo and Franz, and I don't think they feel like they need a traditional point guard out there, which, by the way, evidenced by the fact that Fultz played only 21 minutes a game in the 43 games he was upright, and Cole Anthony played 22 minutes a game as more of a scoring point guard. But I don't think that they feel like they need a traditional point guard out there. So the hope, then, is to just turn this team into a smash mouth. Sort of New York Knicksian, honestly. Like if Tom Thibodeau wasn't coaching the Knicks, the team that you'd be like, Tibbs is going to love that one. Orlando. Suggs, lockdown perimeter defender. And if he plays more than 27 minutes a game this coming year, more than 2 combined steals and blocks is within reach. 2 steal blocks combined, 2 3-pointers. You're talking about 4 combined in those categories. That's a solid mark. Fear for Suggs is that the shots don't continue to increase, and that might be the case. But maybe he can push his way up to 10 instead of 9.5. I don't know. I would hope the free throw shooting moves up from 76 towards 80. He started the year in the 80s and fell off a cliff as the season went on. I don't expect rebounds or assists to change all that much, although maybe you see a few more assists over the entire season with just fewer point guard minutes out there for the other guys. If he's just sort of like de facto point guard some of the time, that would be good. That might get assists from 2.7 to like 3.1. So this is an interesting discussion because I just talked about how Paolo Banchero might improve incrementally in 3 categories, and I don't care. If Jalen Suggs improves incrementally in 3 categories, I do care because he was sitting right on that edge of kind of, I would start them every day versus doesn't matter. Remember we talked about the doesn't matter type of players, the dudes where you could start them, not start them. I sort of don't care either way. They'll be fine. If you start him, you won't be that mad about it. And if you bench him, you won't be pissed that you missed out a bunch of stuff. Suggs was kind of in that range for a lot of the year after the hot start. But again, we're talking about if 27 minutes becomes 29 and you're adding whatever that is, like 7% of more stuff to everything, and let's say free throw percent gets a little bit better, that's notable because 1.4 steals, you add a 10th to that. 1.4 becoming 1.5 is a big deal. 0.6 blocks becoming 0.65 blocks. These are actually big deals over an entire year. You're talking about an extra 7 to 10 steals for Roto. What if those fall in a 2-week bunch in head-to-head? It's a big deal. 0.4 assists per game over 70 ball games. That's notable for an entire season. So Suggs is a guy I would consider. Now, we need to get confirmation that he's the other starter, that they're not going to go more traditional point guard or whatever, or gigantic. But I would think that he's got the inside track to it after as good as he looked this past season. And if we do get that confirmation, he's a guy I would think about drafting after about pick 115. I think he'll be there. I think. He might be one of the guys that goes in that 95 to 120 range, and then we'll have to figure out where in that range we'd be comfortable taking him. And the last player I want to talk about on the Magic, I always do this. Every day I start the podcast and I'm like, I'm going to remember to say, oh, we're going to take a break now for a couple of commercials. And then I never do it. So whatever, it dropped in somewhere and you guys have already heard them. But before we do Jonathan Isaac, who I know you guys want to hear me talk about, please do, towards the end of the show now, take that extra moment to like, rate, and subscribe. Pause the show if you need to, or do it while you're listening. We've seen a nice little bump again on Apple, on Spotify in particular, of folks that have dropped those 5-star ratings. We've seen the YouTube growth up around 400, which, again, it's really hard, by the way, guys, to start a brand new YouTube channel. But we're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there. And I want it already to have that nice base, all the different feeds, honestly. I want that nice base before we hit the real ramp-up season, which, again, frankly, might start in a week. God, that would be amazing. I'm getting really excited thinking about the fact that we may have leagues open a week from today on Yahoo, because that's when people start to really pay attention again. Oh, baby. Okay, so Jonathan Isaac requires a lot of discussion, because this is a dude that just cannot, for the life of him, stay healthy. But the last time he was healthy, which was like 4.5 years ago, I mean, it is forever ago. How long have we been sitting on this Jonathan Isaac thing? It's basically since the COVID year. And then he got in trouble for being a right winger in the NBA. Let's say get in trouble. That's probably not the right term, but there was controversy around that. It was the national anthem kneeling stuff. And then it was missing 2 seasons with 1 injury, and then it was coming back and then not really being able to play again. But I want to try, if we can, do your best, listening audience, to just forget all the other stuff with Jonathan Isaac, however you may feel about it. You guys know how I feel about all that stuff from listening to me over the years. But just block it out, because he hasn't really done anything like critically harmful. There are other guys in the NBA that I'm avoiding putting on my fantasy team because they've done truly awful things. Jonathan Isaac, whatever. Let's just ignore it if we can. And if we can do that and just try to take him for the career arc it's been, there's some interesting stuff at play right in this very moment. First of all, let me remind you guys, the last time Jonathan Isaac was a full-time NBA player was late 2019. He played 34 games that season before blowing his leg out, and then he didn't play again for 2.5 years. That season, okay, look, he's not getting anywhere near this in minutes played, but he played 29 minutes per game that year, averaged 12 points, 7 boards, a 3-ball, 1.5 assists, roughly 4 combined defensive stats on 47-78 splits. He was a mid-second rounder, mostly because of the defensive stats, but it was ridiculous. It was a joyful time. But there is no joy in Mudville. Or there hasn't been in a while. Until the last few seconds. Basically, if you're like taking the Jonathan Isaac career arc, we do this with like the creation of the Milky Way galaxy and, how many billions and billions of years, and then our lifetime is like one little itty bitty grain of sand at the very end of all that. If we just look at the last grain of sand in the Jonathan Isaac hourglass, something interesting happened. And that interesting thing that happened was that Jonathan Isaac played like kind of slightly bigger minutes at the very end of the last regular season and then in the very first game of the playoffs. And it almost went unnoticed because who the hell was paying attention to Orlando Magic games on April 12th and April 14th? Nobody with a modicum of sanity in their trousers, I'll tell you that. But in those last two games, Jonathan Isaac played 27 and 26 minutes. And he didn't do anything earth-shattering or mind-blowing in those games. He had 5 points, 9 boards, a steal, and a block in one of them. Meh. And he had 10 points, 8 boards, a steal, and 3 blocks, and 2 3-pointers, okay, in the other one as a starter. And he started the first 2 games of their playoff series against the Cavaliers. And I think he also actually started game 6 in that series. But what's notable, as they started the construction again next door, is that Jonathan Isaac played 29 minutes in that first playoff game against the Cavaliers. He didn't get anywhere near that again later in the series. It dropped to 19 and a half, 16, 19 and a half, 22, 23, and 18. But he did it once. Overall, the full breadth of those, I guess that'd be 9 games altogether, was not super enthralling. You know, he averaged 7.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, a steal, and 2 blocks in those last regular season games. In the playoffs, I can't do that math in my head. But the first game was solid. He had 10, 5, and 6 defensive stats with 2 3-pointers. Second game, he went for 3 points, 4 boards, and 2 blocks. Then 8 and 2 with a steal and a block. 14 and 7 with a steal and 2 blocks. That was the game they won by 23. They played a lot better at home. And then the other game that he started, he put up a goose egg on offense, had a block and 9 rebounds, basically. So what is the real upside here? Well, it's capped by the fact that, again, his body's just not going to handle the rigors of the long NBA season. But they were able to deploy him in a slightly larger role. And I don't think it was coincidence. Basically, anytime they had multiple days off between basketball games. So, what does this mean for those of us playing redraft leagues this season? My Jonathan Isaac take is, in head-to-head, you can't touch him with a 3,000-foot pole because he's probably going to rest back-to-backs, or if he doesn't rest them, they're going to do the thing where they play him 12 minutes in both games of the back-to-back, which is blech. In Games Cap Roto, I would strongly suggest drafting Jonathan Isaac with your very last pick. And if other analysts start to be a little bit higher on him, then we might have to go with our penultimate pick. So let's say you're talking Yahoo public leagues where it's a 13-round draft. So we're talking about 12th round instead of 13th round. If you can get Jonathan Isaac at about pick 140, I think you're swimming in joy. And this, again, is Games Cap formats only. I would consider taking him as early as pick 120, depending on what guys are already off the board, because you're talking about a dude where if we can figure out a pattern, a method to the madness, where it's like, look, if Orlando has a day off, let's say they have one day off in between games and they're not traveling or something like that, and that's a day where we know Jonathan Isaac is going to get 22 minutes, I would probably play him in a Roto League. Or what if the Magic have 2 days off between games, whether or not they travel? And it's like, okay, this is one where Isaac might get 24 minutes. I play him. They've got a back-to-back? I don't. But it feels like almost found money at the very end of a draft to be able to just pick him up and say, let's figure out how he's going to get deployed this year. And if it's anything like what we saw in those last 9 games, that's all I'm talking about right now, the last 9 games, then there may be something there. By the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that if you look a little bit earlier in the Jonathan Isaac game logs from this past season, you can find, okay, there's a 22-minute game. Yes, there was obviously a day off before and a day off after. He didn't play, by the way, in the game after that. He didn't play for 4 days after that ball game. Then he played 5 minutes in a game where he came out because there was fear of an injury. If you go and you find the game where he played 24 minutes about a half month earlier, that came after a 3-day break. They played March 23rd. He played 23 minutes in that one and had a big line, by the way. And then he came back, and they didn't play again until the 27th. And he played 24 and a half minutes in that ball game. I think that there is a method to the madness on sort of tracking the Jonathan Isaac playing time stuff. And it has a lot to do with the schedule. So if we can nail that down, and, we can look at the Magic schedule before the season starts and try to figure out what it all means, man. Or we can just draft him at the end of a Games Cap fantasy draft, take him with your 12th, 13th rounder, and figure it out on the fly. Either way, I'm okay with it. All right, we'll be back a little bit later on today with the Washington Wizards. I have lots of thoughts, and many of them are about Jordan Poole. But we'll put a pin in this one. Again, we're doing a little bit differently today, where each show is going to have its own little real chunk, where I didn't just record two back-to-back and mush them together or splice them apart. These are true, actual show quanta, a show packet. Like, rate, and subscribe. I say it again. And I'll see you a little bit later on today for the Wizards. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Later.